So I'm grateful to have Professor Felipe Hinojosa, Associate Professor in History from Texas A&M University with us today. We're going to be talking to him about his research in Latinx religion and race and kind of historical context, and how some of his thinking has kind of informed his responses to what's been going on. Dr. Hinojosa has a long history of kind of looking at issues of immigration in the Latinx community, as well as kind of how racial identity and religion kind of play issues that complicate as well as create new opportunities for engagement in contemporary society, especially here in Texas. So thank you for being with us today. Well, you've done a lot of work, and so instead of just focusing on one specific study, I was wondering if you could just kind of sum up maybe in 2 or 3 key points, what are the key findings or arguments that you've tried to make in your work, especially related to issues of religion and race and the Latinx community experience here in America and in Texas?
In terms of looking at religious political history, which is what I really focus on, this is really a new field in maybe the last 20 or 25 years that has really sort of taken off. That's not to say that there weren't other writings, in the 60s or in the 70s, but that kind of the professionalization and the maturation of the field really takes off in the late 90s and early 2000s. And so prior to that, and even up to this point, what you have in Latinx religious studies is a heavy emphasis on culture and belief systems, what people believe about God and the sacred, how they live out those beliefs in their everyday life, sort of lived religion ideals, but not so much about the political side, not so much in terms of how that faith then inspires folks to march or organize or, turn their churches into, part-time community centers, as some have done. So for me, I went in wanting to sort of answer these questions because those are questions that are really rooted in Latinx history. How, have communities organized against injustice and against oppression? So for me, I think the, sort of two points that have really stood out in the work that I've done is, number one, that there is a sort of an unexplored yet quite fascinating radical tradition within Latinx religious history that has to do with inspiring independence movements, certainly in Mexico. The notion and the use of La Virgen de Guadalupe, leading the charge for the United Farm Worker Movement in Central California and in Texas as well. And that linkage of religion and radical politics, which has its roots in Latin America and has its roots obviously here in the Southwest and throughout the United States. That's been sort of the biggest finding. And I've tried to do that in bits and pieces by looking at denominational histories, and then now in this newer project, looking at community politics and neighborhood politics. The second thing that I would really sort of highlight is the fact that these religious politics, I think we sometimes sort of tend to see politics as sort of an outward projection of our belief systems or understandings of God and the sacred. And many times these have very public manifestations, whether it's marching in the streets or, like I was saying, turning the church into a community center and all that. But I think an understudied part of that is that within the Latinx community, it's very specific and it's been very sort of underground in a lot of ways, primarily because you're working with, especially in Pentecostal communities or in Catholic churches, you're working primarily with an undocumented population. Or that's where a lot of the focus then tends to be. And when your church is predominantly Mexican-American or Latinx in general, you're also a target, regardless of your citizenship status and regardless of where you stand. And so churches have to be very careful in terms of how they navigate those politics. And they have been. And I think that's another kind of way of understanding Latinx religion, is that a lot of times what gets in the popular press or in the popular media is this sort of idea that Latinx religious communities tend to be very sort of conservative politically and theologically. And I think what you actually understand, or I think what's actually happening, is that you have churches that tend to be more conservative theologically, but much more progressive politically. And that's a highlight that I love to sort of in the work that I've done, and certainly the work that other historians have done, and try to sort of move beyond this understanding that somehow Latinx religious communities have been apolitical throughout their history, or don't care about politics, that somehow their only concern is with the other life or with the afterlife and trying to gain salvation. Not saying that that's not important, certainly is with Latinx communities, but so is the political.
Does religion and faith complicate discussions about racism, especially kind of in the current kind of context and ethos that we're in? Talking about the Latinx tradition, the liberation theology basically was born out of that tradition, and especially discourse happening in Central and South America. So there is a strong kind of connection. But in what ways do you think it's helpful, or what ways is it more complicated now with what's going on currently?
I think a big part of it has been churches now in this moment. You have a community that is not only trying to redefine how it engages, how it gets on social media, how it engages elders that don't have access to don't have internet access or whatever it may be. And so churches are sort of trying to figure all this stuff out at the same time that people, for a variety of reasons, whether some that might be essential workers and others that are maybe at home more, are watching what's happening in the news. And certainly the Black Lives Matter protests that were sparked with the murder of George Floyd. And so and Latinx communities, I think, coming to terms with where's our history and where do we fit in these conversations, and what have we done in the past? And not only that, not only sort of these external projections, but also internally in terms of thinking about the Afro-Latinx community, the ways in which colorism operates within our own communities. White supremacy and white power are not the sole domain of the United States, right? We don't have a monopoly on that. And I think, some of the conversations that I've had with church leaders and religious leaders have been around how their churches then are starting to think about, well, how do we do social education? How do we talk about these issues? And how can we bring, the Bible and our Bible studies more in tune with what's going on in the social realm? And of course, none of that is new. You pointed out liberation theology, and that's sort of at the root of these, in Latin America, especially these comunidades de base, these base communities, where there was this sort of theological reflection on poverty and on injustice. And it's just interesting to see that kind of resurface all over again, and to be coming up in the way that it is. And I think the moment is different. I think what's happening now is that, we're in this moment all over again, and churches are really being forced to consider themselves all over again, how they're going to engage these very sort of serious issues of race and injustice within their communities, and responding to that in effective ways.
So the Latinx community is no stranger to experiencing racial injustice and racism, especially here in Texas. But to what extent is the experience of the Black community similar or different to what the Latin community is experienced and has experienced? And how have these two communities related to one another historically and kind of in the present moment?
Areas that I think these two communities can converge, and there's also areas in which these communities have very different needs and ideas. When you're talking about the Latinx community and you're talking about doing church and doing politics, immigration is front and center, and so is bilingual church services or Spanish church services. Those two things might be distinct. On every other plane, education, healthcare, access, jobs, poverty, those are the areas where there is a lot more sort of collaborative efforts to bring these two communities together, or where they are working in many ways.
I just want to thank you, Dr. Joseph, for being with us today. I thank you for your important insights and just truly challenge us to look at kind of what some things that are right in front of us, especially here in the Texas context, that we really need to bring to bear when we're looking at kind of how do we, in a religious community, respond to the racial tensions and injustice that are around us right now. So thank you very much.
Hey, thank you. This was fun.